Hi everyone, my name is Greg Gillespie. I wanted to take the opportunity to speak to the Dungeons and Dragons movie and why it sucks so hard, and I've put together a bit of a visual essay to discuss it. I want to preface everything I'm going to say in the next wee while here with an understanding that nobody wants to watch a good Dungeons and Dragons movie more than I do. That's the truth. I really would. But that's not what we have here. So, I think it's important, if you go see a movie, you walk away from it and say, yeah, that was fun, had a little bit of action, took my son, took my nephew, what have you, and then you walk away from it, and perhaps you didn't think past the initial visual representations. And I think there's a lot more going on here that, quite honestly, doesn't send very positive messages to young men. And I think there's an opportunity to discuss it, debrief it here, and that's what I want to do. I've organized my thoughts thematically. So I'm not going to deal with things chronologically. It's roughly chronological, but it's more directed at themes I want to discuss. Some of these are more serious than others, and some are tongue-in-cheek, but hopefully those will provide entertainment value. So let's get started. The themes I'd like to discuss today include the depiction of medieval fantasy versus the fantastical, the issue of used universe, representation and emasculization, which are the dominant themes put in front of your eyes here. I want to talk about the pipeline to nowhere. I want to talk about self-reflexivity or self-reflectiveness. I want to talk about racial hypocrisy. I want to talk about some WTF moments. I want to talk about fan service. And I also want to talk about cultural appropriation. With that, let's get started. One of the things that really bugged me about this film was that we have 20 years worth of some fairly decent fantasy adventure on the big and small screens. We have the Lord of the Rings films, we have the Hobbit films, we have 8 years of Game of Thrones, we have a year of House of the Dragon, in which we have some pretty darn good fantasy. And that fantasy has broad appeal. So people who never read the Lord of the Rings books have probably seen at least one of the Lord of the Rings films. People who never read George R. R. Martin's books probably saw at least one season of Game of Thrones. And in those examples, we have medieval fantasy set forward for us versus what I call the fantastical. The fantastical is the representation of fantasy divorced from its Western medieval origins. And this has happened not only in WotC's editions, but we get it depicted for us here on the screen as well. What happens when you do that, when you divorce fantasy from its medieval roots, it becomes increasingly fantastical. It's a circle jerk, and it just keeps going around in its own circle, divorced from it. It's not anchored down. It's completely divorced from the origins of the hobby, from the texts that were consulted in its initial construction. Here we go. For the first minute of the film, we get this depiction for us. So this is Michel Foucault's Panopticon, if you're not familiar with that. And what you can do here is you can see I'm using a bootleg copy of this film because I refuse on principle to give this company my money because they hate me. They have made that explicitly clear by Kyle Binks, the PR director. They don't want me to see this film. It's not intended for me. And I'm going to demonstrate exactly what rests behind the representation of white men in this film. So this is the fantastical. Could we get the depiction of a prison that looks cool by dialing this back significantly? And the answer is yes. This is overdone. This is the fantastical. This is not medieval fantasy. Here again, later in the film, with the Colosseum. So, have any of you ever played air hockey? You remember, the gondola that you put the little puck in, and table hockey, and it drops the puck down. That's what I saw in my mind's eye when I looked at this. We could have the representation of a gladiatorial pit or the Roman gladiatorial Colosseum from the film Gladiator. But no, that's not what we've got. We've got the puck dropping gondola that makes no sense. This is the fantastical over medieval fantasy. Here again, we go to the floor of the Colosseum and we have this strange device that makes no sense at all, that serves really sort of no purpose. Could you have effectively created a scene here without this strange floor that rotates randomly and makes no sense? Yeah, you could. This is the fantastical over medieval fantasy. The representation of the Underdark, because of course we have to include that. Again, this is very, very broad brush. This looks like the Toronto skyline at nighttime. Not what I want from my medieval fantasy. This is the fantastical divorced from medieval fantasy. Now, let's play a little hypothetical game. Let's say you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, well, Greg, you're kind of overstating your case. All right, I'll take that position for a moment. Let's discuss the issue from the opposite end of the question. What other depictions do we get beyond these odd, fantastical representations? We get Ren fairs. Like, look at this. I've gone to Ren fairs with higher production value from strangers than what you see here. And it doesn't look to me like much of this was run through the washing machine prior to wardrobe call on set. And look at that axe. I think I saw that at the Dollarama 5 years ago for like $3. And a side note, we normally get Uilleann pipes playing in the background of these Ren Fair scenes, just like the Knights of Badassdom, right? But the Knights of Badassdom was actually better than this. And here we go again, another Ren Fair scene. Really, again, no used universe here. I'm leading into my next theme. Let's get to that one. I know if you're watching this video, you enjoy science fiction and fantasy adventure just like I do. And we have some terrific films that show used universe, right? This kind of started with Star Wars, and in a sort of a big time way where everything looked like it had been used and reused and adapted. Symbols on spaceships would be weathered. You'd have different plates of different color gray on spaceships as if they had been sort of pieced together or adapted over time. The Millennium Falcon comes to mind. A lot of the X-Wings come to mind. And then, of course, we get that carried forward as well during that same time period with things like the Alien film. And then, of course, Aliens, James Cameron's Aliens. We also get the real great example of this, of course, is going to be Lord of the Rings, where they were meticulously detailed on putting forward the used universe look. Like, look at that depiction of Aragorn. He's a total, the king in exile, but he's got both the look, he's got both the weathered garb, the hair is not coiffed. And of course, then you can go over and you can look at the orcs, who are extremely cool. Again, the kind of the mass-produced hastily put together armor, adapted, modified over combat, rough edges on things, and so on and so forth. This deepens the verisimilitude of fantasy. This is not what we get in the Dungeons and Dragons film. And if you have a budget of $150 million, pay a kid minimum wage to sit there and whack clothing with a hammer if you have to, give us some used universe. This is a great example. Again, the axe, I noted it a few moments ago. This just does not look like, come on, it's just plastic. This doesn't hold a candle to anything put on Game of Thrones or to anything to put in Lord of the Rings. And these are the subtle details that make the difference between success and failure. So if you think of a season of Game of Thrones as what? 8 hours? Maybe 10 hours? Slightly less? This film had to not bugger it up for an hour and 20 minutes. That was it. Provide some verisimilitude for an hour and 20 minutes. Again, look at the outfits. There is no used universe really happening here. And he's one buckle away from Thriller. And those are not particularly intimidating tattoos, right? And again, look at the size difference. I am all for the depiction of a 6-foot, muscular, badass woman barbarian. I'm all for it. That is not what we have here. I don't know what this woman's height is. I'm going to ballpark her at 5'5" as a rough guess. And she's throwing men around in armor like it's tissue, like they're tissue paper. And all he's got is a lute to beat people with. This is the kind of lack of verisimilitude that breaks the frame. You can't become invested in the depiction of fantasy unless you have that verisimilitude. You have to have it. It's non-negotiable. Let's take another look, a little bit closer. Look at the outfits. Is there any dirt on them? Have they been patched? Have they been worn? Or did somebody go into a Ren Fair closet and come out with these costumes? Breaks the frame. It totally breaks the frame. Now let's get to the meat and potatoes now that we've got warmed up with representation and emasculization. And I'm not going to use my own club to beat the writers and directors of this film. I'm going to use their club. And they made this available for everyone to read when they put forward this stupid article where they come out and tell you they're intentionally emasculating the representation of leading men. Don't take my word for it. Take theirs. But let's look past the veneer. Let's do a little bit more of a substantive dive into what we see. And let's go back to the opening of the film. So here we have this example where the orc character, I guess, comes into the cell. Look at the positions of these two characters. So the barbarian is so short, her feet don't even touch the ground. She's upright and eating. And look at the depiction of the white dude, Chris Pine. He's prone, effectively, laying down, knitting. So what they're doing is right here is just a traditional, plain old gender swap. So she's upright, she's eating, her feet don't even touch the ground. He's laying down, submissive, and knitting. The first 5 minutes, so think about some of the great, truly great first lines in literature, right? In the beginning, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, which is grammatically one of the worst sentences in the history of the English language. The point is, they're remembered. First sentences matter. This is your first sentence. Is this what you want put forward to your young son or to your nephew about what it means to be a young man. Let's continue. Here we get a close-up of the knitting, right? Then the scene begins to develop. And here we get the tiny wee barbarian kicking the knees out from the larger monstrous humanoid. Now, if you think across film, particularly recently in the MCU and things like that, you get a lot of white men on their knees in front of a woman. And either they get kicked in the balls, or they're on their knees. So this is a kick to the knees, but it's a metaphorical kick in the balls, right? And this scene does a terrific job of laying that out for you visually. Then we move further into the film, and we get this example of the barbarian taking out all these men in armor. A close-up. Yeah, so we have to make sure it's a white dude who's about to get his ass kicked, and he's also wearing the Ren Fair garb that never has seen a scratch in its life. As the action begins to take place and the barbarian's doing what she does, throwing men around like tissue paper, Chris Pine's character is doing nothing. He's just trying to cut the rope. And when he does actually do anything, he just gets a bash in with his loot, and that's about it. Further, now that we've established the white dude who gets his butt kicked, and the other helmed warriors who we can then extrapolate are also white dudes getting their butt kicked, we move to the depiction of the owlbear scene with implied white dudes getting their butt kicked. Another great scene is when the tiefling character, she's half something. That's apparently a no-no, given what Watsy just said. We get this scene. This scene is really interesting because there's a couple things that happen. The young woman interrogates Chris Pine on his value as a member of the party. And she effectively says, "You're a failure. The things you do are failures." And he has no retort, really. No, they're not failures. I just make new plans. So there's no counter, right? He is effectively prostrating himself to this interrogation. The emasculization vis-a-vis the depiction of race is further confirmed with the paladin character, who is actually kind of interesting, but just a straw character. There's no depth. There's no real engagement. He just shows up his purpose is to highlight Chris Pine's inadequacy. That's the purpose of this character. We can move forward to another scene where everyone's sitting around talking about how everyone's a failure, and Chris Pine acknowledges that he's the biggest failure of them all. So you're seeing not just the motif come forward, it's being reiterated, and it's being reiterated, and it's being reiterated. And if that wasn't enough, you get the comedic portrayal, right? So Chris Pine's character is supposed to be the protagonist, but he's really just plucky comic relief. And this is just so tired. This is lazy writing. It's really tired. It's really boring. It's really lazy. And there's so much left. There's so much meat on the bone. There's so much left on the table. But no, they want to emasculate the leading men and send particular discursive messages to you as the viewer. There are a few scenes that are effectively like a pipeline to nowhere. They serve no purpose. So this scene, we get this. This is actually kind of interesting. I loved the voice. The voice was really good. You only see the eye point. We're wondering if there's some sort of demon or devil who's pulling the strings in the background. But it goes nowhere. It goes absolutely nowhere. This is what we call a fishhook. So a fishhook is one of those things where you throw it out in the water and then you never reel it back in. And that is lazy writing. It's poor. It's just not good enough. Don't bring something forward to then not address it. It's just a big, colossal waste of time. Another big, colossal waste of time was the Raising the Dead scene. So the Raising the Dead scene could be super cool, but they're being self-reflexive here. Now, I'm highlighting this because my next theme is going to be self-reflexive. So you will come back to this. But doing this once, you could be done in a really cool way. Speaking with the dead, is supposed to be a really cool thing when you role play it at the table, but it's just made into a puppet show. Like, it's literally just a puppet show. It could have been cool, but it's not cool. It's just laughable. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there's great opportunity for humor here, but the humor can't be the text. The humor has to be the subtext, and it's not the subtext. It's the main text. This is the kind of thing, this is the difference between doing something well and not doing it well, okay? So just give a little bit of consideration there. Dial back the humor. Bring forward the story. Then make that last question, or the second last question he asks of the undead, a joke. But when you've done it like with three different speak with deads, it's lost its punchline. It's too much. Another pipeline to nowhere is just these scenes. So this scene, I put it under this heading because this highlights the used universe bit, right? So the bad plastic axe gets messed up and doesn't really have any punch. She just says, "Oh, it looks cool," and okay, but where's it going? Like, what's the point? And again, we're getting the helmed, assumed white dudes getting their butt kicked. So there's just not a lot happening here. It's a pipeline to nowhere alongside the demon issue, alongside the Speak with Dead. Self-reflectiveness. So self-reflexivity is when a popular culture item or construct makes reference to itself and its own artificiality. So an example of this in film would be breaking the fourth wall. So when an actor or actress directly looks at you, the viewer, and addresses you, breaking that fourth wall. And thereby, this happens in RPG art too, and I actually enjoy some self-reflexivity. I really do. But again, this is a question of taste. When should you let self-reflexivity ever become the main text? The answer is no. It has to remain the subtext only, because when you have a film that is acknowledging itself as an RPG construct and back and forth, at that stage, you're losing the narrative. So it needs to be in the background, and it needs to stay in the background. And that's one of the reasons why I brought up the Speak with Dead scene. The Speak with Dead scene is self-reflexive because it's acknowledging its own artificiality by doing it again and making it boring. Then you have the Speak with Dead skeletal constructs getting cheeky back with the characters, and that's too much. Another great example of this, again, there are multiple examples. I'm not going to beat it over the head, but another great example is when we get Captain Kirk talking on the tricorders. So this is just not good enough. It's a cheap gag. Let's be honest, right? It's just a cheap gag, and I don't really buy it. I think you could have done this in a cool in-game way, and this is a parlor trick. And I'm much more interested in substantive things and not parlor tricks. The racial hypocrisy is something that's worth discussing. It's at the forefront because the whole film is about representation and emasculization. And when we consider the comments that just came forward at the D&D Influencer Summit, it's really quite interesting, where they said effectively that in Dungeons and Dragons, half anything characters are fundamentally racist. And I find it just drips with hypocrisy that we get this young fellow here highlighting the fact explicitly that he says, I'm only half human, right? And this is in the context of another scene that I'm going to highlight again here in a moment. So keep this one in mind. He very explicitly says, I'm only half human. Now, if that's your opinion, that should have been communicated from the people at the property to the people making the film. And that should have been edited out. Now, I'm not one of those people. I don't really care about whether you like or dislike some small thing. If your butt hurt, suck it up. It's just too bad. Don't play that game then. Don't go watch those movies. If you don't like something, vote with your wallet. So this is the kind of thing where the right hand clearly has no idea what the left hand is doing. And of course, they do it right in the wake of this film coming out. It's literally shooting yourself in the foot. Continuing the theme of hypocrisy, we get this character who's actually pretty interesting. And she has a great filmic look. But it's my understanding, I've never played a tiefling character. It's my understanding, that they're half something, right? And so if you believe in the confines of your game that something is that egregiously wrong, why the heck do you have it in your movie? Why? I don't understand why the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. It's hypocrisy. And all this nonsense about white men need to get out of the hobby and they can't leave fast enough, while at the same time you're saying, well, half anything characters are fundamentally wrong, and then your main depiction, the one you're putting out there for a broad audience in addition to your fandom, you're contradicting yourself. In that same discussion I mentioned a moment ago, we get the tiefling character who looks directly at Chris Pine, and she says, I don't trust humans. I find you. She looks directly at Chris Pine, not the young magician, person of color, not the barbarian, person of color. She looks directly at Chris Pine and says, I find you to be hateful and selfish. I think that really speaks for itself. Don't play the games of the people that hate you. Anything written anywhere, any filmic depiction anywhere, has some WTF moments. No one's immune. Things happen. Sometimes they're small. Sometimes they're quite large. I have no idea what was happening here. None. This is like Moe, Larry, and Curly. And I don't get it. At first I didn't, I'm like, is this like a little person? Is it a halfling? What's happening here? And then that becomes a little bit more apparent later on when the barbarian character goes to see her little dude. Again, it's a white dude, right? Every relationship in this film is interracial. That's sending a message. But this specifically is sending a message about representation, about emasculization, not only racially, but also from a gender standpoint. So look at the, in this example, we have the barbarian who now, in contrast to this halfling character, looks like a redwood tree. And here we have, so the perspective is really important here. It's so important that they show the perspective from the other side, right? Lo, be the white man in front of the massive masculine barbarian, right? Again, they've got their club. They're beating you over the head with it. Are you paying attention? And again, this is what the representation of white men has been reduced to. This is a reflection of ideology. And if you can't pick and choose, if you think that half characters are effectively inherently wrong, then why are you doing this? Like, I don't understand it. How is this less wrong than the depictions and the text of the film that we have earlier? I don't understand it. And if the first perspective didn't let it settle in, if the second perspective didn't let it settle in, if this perspective didn't let it settle in, you get another opportunity to get beaten over the head with the club. This is what these people think of white men. They made it clear. I am just the messenger. I didn't make this film. And this is what you have. I'm going to transition now to talk about a couple things, that I liked. We do have some explicit fan service going on here. We've got a couple little rust monsters. But what I don't understand is in a minute, as they move up through the stairs, you're going to get all these dudes in armor. How would these rust monsters not be freaking out to jump on the dudes in armor? So a fan service item only makes sense in the confines of the game and the fandom, and this makes no sense. How on earth Chris Pine could be standing in front of a cage saying this is the way out makes no sense. And that does not look like Bobby the Barbarian. Nor does this look like Eric the Cavalier. And I think the Brazilian commercial did a much better job of representing what a live action version of what the Dungeons and Dragons characters would look like than this bit of fan service. I like axe beaks, but I don't like domesticated axe beaks. That's just not cool. One thing I did like is the series of scenes we get when they come up with a plan to use the staff to sneak into the vault, and the hijinks that play themselves out. I think that was very much the heart of Dungeons and Dragons. You create a plan, then you get smacked in the face. The plan goes wrong. How do you improvise? How do you make it out? I think that's the essence of every edition of Dungeons and Dragons, or at least it should be. I don't think the more recent versions do that very well. But having said that, if I was to provide kudos, this is, I think, the scene using the getting caught between the two windows, getting pulled in, getting pulled back out, the carriage moving along. Those are great. That was fun. I thought overall the owl bear was pretty cool, but again, it's set within other forms of representation that I don't agree with. Cultural appropriation. So if you are going to sewer the representation of white men, if you are going to emasculate them back into the Stone Age, if you are going to show them with very little agency vis-a-vis all the other characters in the film, you have no right to use the cultural music of those people. So if you don't know, I'm a Highland bagpiper. I play multiple different kinds of bagpipes. I also play tin whistle. And this is called the Ulan pipe. It's a bellows blown bagpipe common in Ireland. And if you are going to emasculate white men throughout your film, you don't get the right to use Ulan pipes in your feature film. I don't agree with it. And I've got another point on cultural appropriation coming up in a moment. We then move to the conclusion where we get the ultimate super happy multicultural ending, and you can draw your conclusions as to whether you found that satisfactory or not. And the epilogue here, as we warm down, I'm going to highlight the cultural appropriation again. So here we have a font inspired by Celtic fonts. That's where this is coming from. You don't get the right to use this. And your sort of medieval inspired end credits hold no value or weight with me after you just emasculated every white man in the depiction of your film from start to finish. The Dungeons and Dragons movie, at the end of the day, got one thing right. It's certainly based on Hasbro's Dungeons and Dragons.